to the University of Portsmouth, welcome to the Institute of Criminal Justice Studies, and what is the first virtual study day of 2019. We're so pleased that you're joining us today. Whatever the weather, where you are, settle down with us for the next couple of hours as we've got some really interesting sessions, I hope, that will be useful and informative for you. We've got sessions on what's important in security. We're talking about fraud. We've got a chat about dissertations, about what makes a good dissertation, how to structure your dissertation. We've got Gordon coming in later to talk about writing better essays. And of course, Linda from the library, who will be looking at better and more accurate literature searching. So we've got all of that coming up for you today. We'd really like you to join in if you can. Ask us questions, post us your comments. All you need to do is click on the comment underneath the video. If you can log in beforehand, please do that by clicking on the avatar in the top right-hand corner. Log in beforehand, and then you can comment and ask us questions all morning. And we will try to answer as many of those as we can live on air this morning for you. We've also got a prize for you if you're watching out there. So please, if you're watching out there, wherever you are, and if you can get a bit of snow in the background, even better, please take a photo of yourselves wherever you're watching our virtual study day this morning and tweet us that photo or post it on Instagram or post it on Facebook with the hashtag ICJS VSD19. And that's not just to confuse you, that's ICJS VSD19. That's the hashtag. So post your pictures to us, and there is a prize. And you can see the prize here, a lovely University of Portsmouth hoodie. So please post that photo wherever you are, and we will decide on the prize at the end of the day. If you're not watching live, however, you're very welcome to, excuse me, to post us a photo. But I'm afraid the hoodie may well have already gone, so apologies for that. So we've got a really good session for you lined up now. I'm joined on the sofa by Dean Blackburn. Good morning, Dean.
Good morning, Sarah.
Dean is the course leader of our Bachelor of Science undergraduate degree in Counter Fraud and Criminal Justice Studies. So Dean and I are going to be having a chat this morning about all issues to do with measuring fraud and the difficulties of measuring fraud. So if you've got any questions about this, if you're a fraud student or indeed if you're a student on one of our other degrees as well, please just post your question or your comment and Dean will try to answer it for you if you can. But while you're thinking up those questions, I've got a few for you to start you off. And first of all, Dean, I suppose what we're interested in really is why is measuring fraud so important?
I suppose it's like any aspect in crime. If you don't know what you're dealing with until you measure it. So by measuring, it gives us a guesstimate, I suppose is the right word to say, as to what we're dealing with and the extent of that problem. By doing so, with such an indicator of what you measure, it enables you then to think about where you're going to where do you need to direct your resources in dealing with fraud. So where are the trends, where are the issues that's relevant today, and you can direct then your resources appropriately to deal with those problem areas, so to speak.
If we know the true picture of what's out there.
Because as you know, there's always the dark figure of crime. Some would say what we know is merely the tip of the iceberg. And of course that's dependent on many factors as to why people don't report, or more importantly within the field of fraud, not everybody knows they're a victim. Until, someday down the line. You and I could be victims of fraud now. Yeah. Not encouraging anybody. So, there is that, what we see is really a snapshot of what is out there. Yeah. There's complications obviously relating to that as to how truthful that picture is that we're dealing with. And I think we can talk about more about the methodologies of capturing the true nature of fraud out there. Yeah. Too.
Let's go right back to the beginning then. If I am a victim of fraud, where do I start? Who do I report that to? And then what happens in the following stages?
Well, ideally, the process should be to report into action fraud. Action fraud are the first port of call, and they'll pass on the details then to the investigating police. But they can then collate that picture of where those crimes are occurring to. So there are, people are not necessarily informed as to where they need to report these frauds. You do hear stories and testaments to people who become frustrated with the process of reporting, purely on the basis that they get pillar to post. They might go to the police say you have to go to action fraud, and vice versa. I have come across, stories, people telling me about how frustrating they felt the process, or totally naive and ignorant of the fact what they need to do.
What do Action Fraud do then when something's been reported to them?
Well, they collect the data, so they'll analyse the data and basically act upon that data. But purely they've, it's logged. They'll offer you guidance, reassurance and that sort of thing, but also then direct it to the necessary appropriate action.
So they don't investigate the fraud?
No.
They will pass on that information?
Yeah.
Pass on all information of all fraud that's reported to them, or what they deem to be?
I would imagine, I believe they will pass on all. So, I mean, they release their own statistics on frauds that are reported to them, so they have their own reports. But again, their action is only as good as the information they come to know of. So.
Do you think, I don't know if there's been any research on this, but do you think the general public are aware that they don't report fraud to the police, that they should report to Action Fraud?
No. I think there's a we can't call it an ignorance, I suppose, but there needs to be more trafficking, I suppose, as to where you would go with the information, so more direction, really.
Yeah.
So that comes with time. I mean, if the beauty, I suppose, of having research and having as much information out there, seen as with social media savvy nowadays and everything else, I mean, I suppose most people would look to online and do a general search as where do I report my fraud and that kind of thing. But I personally don't think it's visible enough as to where you would report fraud.
I don't think that confusion is just with the public either. I know from some research that's going on at the moment into rogue trading, where the police are confused about whether something should be categorised as a fraud, or whether it's something that should be going to trading standards, or whether it's something that should be going to Action Fraud, or whether it's something that they should be dealing with.
Exactly. So that's where you can see the complexity in our nature, is who takes responsibility for it.
And is there an element of passing things around?
Can I say this on record? I can only go from what I've understood from research that we've done in the past, where the confusion aspect is people get disgruntled and they don't bother reporting, they just give up the ghost. So with their losses, the losses isn't recorded because purely they don't think I can be bothered.
Is this your research with victims of fraud?
Yes, and general conversation with people that you come across. I mean, the frustrations are as well that you could be on the phone to Action Fraud trying to get through, and that's no discredit to Action Fraud. I mean, you have to think about staff who are working for Action Fraud.
Yeah.
They're dealing with some very anxious people. They're not necessarily that well trained on dealing with those people. You've got people working within that department, small department, who are necessarily in need of further expansion funding to do what is a demanding role.
Yeah, because they must be dealing with very distressed and confused people.
I mean, it's 24/7, so how do you contend with that? And when you take pay into consideration as well, training, turnover, because it would be an exhausting role when you haven't had the support and necessary guidance to how you deal with something, then obviously it just becomes a vicious circle with turnover of staff. New staff come in and then it goes on. So there are, people have voiced that it can be up to an hour and a half to get through to Action Fraud.
Yeah.
So the urgency of you as a victim, you want it dealt with now. You haven't got that time. And then also when you do get through, are you necessarily getting the appropriate support for the losses that you've received?
Because as a victim, I suppose if you're a victim of financial fraud, then you need to be dealing with all sorts of other people as well. You need to be ringing up banks or insurance or whatever it might be.
Yeah, again, people are in rabbit in headlights. They don't know which way to go with it. Who do you tell first? I mean, you do have frauds that are handled appropriately by banks, because that should, I personally think, should be your immediate call if it's a loss-free payment, bank payment, because banks have the facility to stop the transfers. So in doing so, that reduces a lot of losses. So you imagine as an individual, you think your first port of call should be Action Fraud to report what's going on, whereas in the immediate time, you could have been onto your bank, you could have prevented, say, for instance, if it's bank connected fraud, and that loss from going out.
Yeah. So there already, we've got quite a lot of confusion. That's just in the reporting stage. So what methods are there to measure fraud?
Okay.
Is that a bit more consistent?
I suppose I should say yes. It's like anything. I try to avoid the word guesstimating, but we've talked about, we know ourselves from studies we've done, you know, methodologies. You'll find even with police statistics, British Crime Survey, methodologies change. So counting methods change. So what happens, patterns that you've probably had beforehand are no longer then consistent. Or you have to take the methodology adaptation into consideration when you're comparing and analysing data. To be honest, I think there's a host of studies that are undertaken out there by organisations, independent organisations, say for CIFERS, Action for Themselves, IFIG. They produce their reports, and as informative as they are, you know, how there's always an element of scepticism, I suppose, in my mind, because you have to think about their methodology. That's not always clear. And you see these nice, glossy, shiny little brochures about fraud and what they've unearthed, what they found. You know, they're sometimes very brief. They're more like promo material, I think, for the organisation than actually dealing with the issues in hand, so to speak. So I think it can become exhaustive consulting with the literature, the reports, on the basis you just don't know how true what it is that you're reading.
Yeah.
But then again, it's in the absence of nothing, it shows a kind of a picture that we can then pursue, or we can take.
I suppose we're starting to see the beginnings of all of this, but I suppose one problem is if you take what's deemed to be the most authoritative source of crime statistics, which would be the Crime Survey for England and Wales, that only started to measure fraud in 2015-16, didn't it? And that was only for half a year, and then they just doubled it, which I'm not a statistician, but that seems a bit odd to me. But what's interesting about that is that the Crime Survey for England and Wales are talking to victims of personal crime, whereas the victims of fraud more generally, you've got corporate fraud, you've got fraud across huge organisations. That wouldn't be included in the Crime Survey for England and Wales.
And nor would the fact that a paper I was reading this morning, interestingly, about SME, small medium enterprises. You know, 50,000 jobs lost this last 6 months as a result of fraud, because those small businesses cannot recoup those losses through fraud. Well, I've not seen, that's not depicted in the British Crime Survey or the Victim Survey. So when you think about, you know, that financial loss, and also this, you know, a small business setting up and it's hit by fraud, to recoup those losses it's a long way to come back. So the easiest thing is to fold and let people go. So 50,000 jobs lost through fraud. I mean, when you think it's said that out of every 2 crimes, 1 is fraud.
Is that fraud and
related.
cyber enabled?
I believe so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is incredible, because for a long time people were arguing that crime was dropping hugely over many years, but it seems that crime was evolving more than dropping, perhaps, because when we start including the fraud and cyber enabled crime
Then
statistics
the
in there,
stats went up, didn't they?
went up hugely.
So
Yeah.
there was a picture that some people didn't necessarily want us to see.
Yeah, but I suppose that takes us back to the thing again, that that's about crimes against the individual. These glossy publications that you're referring to, I presume that's more about corporate fraud, is it business fraud?
They do relate, say, CIFERS will look at victims of fraud or fraudsters that they have on their database and their actions. It depends really on what angle they're looking at, I suppose. They are varied. They're not, you know, there are a host of reports out there looking at businesses as well as individuals. Yeah. And I think that's something we need to bear in mind, that, you know, you can think of fraud and you can think it's towards the individual, when actually, you know, it goes on in all realms. Businesses across the country, across the world, internationally.
Absolutely. What are the strengths and weaknesses of these fraud loss measurement methods? Tell us what they are first of all, and then talk about how they work.
Okay, so really that relates back to the previous conversation. You know, a couple of years ago we was involved in recreating what the National Fraud Authority had done, which had looked at fraud loss, and they tried to put an indicative figure on how much fraud. So when I came into position up in 2012, they were quoting something like £78 billion was lost through fraud annually. So Professor Burton and myself, and in conjunction with Crowe, Whitehill, Jim G and Experian, we worked with Dr. David Shepherd as well, who did a great job on the methodology, meticulous in his analysis. We actually went through and resurrected that old national fraud indicator, to show that actually we're looking at more 950 billion pounds was a more accurate figure.
Wow.
In this country alone.
That's
UK.
incredible.
So it got from 78 billion, which I remember when I came to press, oh my God, that's so much money.
Yeah.
To what our findings were 950 billion pounds.
Yeah.
I mean, that fraud indicator report is available on the website. It gives you a breakdown between public sector, private sector, charitable organisations. So you can actually see that public sector losses, say for instance, when you put it into comparison, is their loss is 38 billion, I think, I've got it on here actually. Yeah, public sector, 37.5 billion out of that 193 billion, take that back.
Yeah, 193 billion.
193 billion.
Just in the UK alone?
Just in the UK alone.
Okay.
37.5 billion of which was public sector fraud loss.
What kind of organisations are we talking then? If we're
So you're
talking
looking
public
at
sector?
NHS,
Yeah.
defence.
Yeah.
And interestingly, that 37.5 billion was, the loss incurred was more than the defence and the NHS budget by the government.
In total? That's incredible.
Yeah. So then you go on to charitable sectors, for instance. Well, there's arguments there as to how seriously they take fraud.
Yeah.
You know, without having to go into too much detail on from the readings we have as to whether they're lagging behind on actually putting countering fraud measures in place is questionable, or how serious they take it. Well, you think how many times, you know, charity sectors can they really afford to lose money, but actually putting their countering fraud measures in place is somewhat lacking.
Yeah.
So then the private sector losses equate to 144 billion out of that 193 billion.
And how equipped are organisations? I suppose I'm quite interested in the public sector one that you mentioned there. How equipped are they to deal with this kind of loss? I mean, you mentioned that public sector loss is more than the budget
for the
health and defence put together. So that's an incredible statistic.
Scary.
Are they equipped to deal with that?
Private sector or public sector?
Let's go public first.
Okay, I'd say with public, then, you know, there's a lot within there, like you've got procurement issues, haven't you, like who you employ and who you offer contracts to. One would say if we revisited this in 3 years' time, would you see a reduction or would you see a further growth?
Yeah.
That's the only way, really. One of the beauties of measuring is you can see the successes as to what's working.
Yes.
Are things being adopted and
Yeah.
implemented in place? Which you do see examples of organisations and, you know, that have implemented change. I mean, you know, late Dr. Martin Tunley always said, the onus should be on organisations as well as the individuals to tackle fraud. We all have a responsibility for that. But it's very hard. I mean, a couple of years ago I remember visiting Ofgem, if I'm allowed to say it, and we discussed their countering fraud strategies that they had in place. And you know, they were very, very keen in actually taking on board the advice to, you know, look at vetting people, looking at their whistleblowing techniques, looking at who they were working with as in contractual wise. You know, there's so many avenues within an organisation where fraud can occur. That's the trouble.
Where's the threat coming from? Is it insider or is it coming from outside?
Well,
or is
it's fair to say both, isn't it?
Okay.
People within the organisation, but persons from outside, whether that be on the contractual basis of procurement or even, you know, hacking.
Okay.
So,
if I was a student and I was going to be writing about fraud measurement in one of my essays, what would be your advice on how to tackle that? Because, I mean, we've only just touched the surface here and it's hugely problematic. Where do I start?
well, I think in all honesty, you're not going to find a shortness of material because there's a host of information out there. I suppose really it's actually getting to grips with understanding how collation of police statistics work, looking at the British Crime Survey, going through and looking at how the stats are recorded, the information given there. But more importantly, you know, if that, it can be a minefield, can't it? Once you get the percentages right, how they portray that info. You know, there's summary sheets for those documents as well, which help to simplify the findings.
Yeah.
But more importantly, you know, there's a host of other, like as we just said before, there's organisations, they publish their own reports, they give an insight, albeit somewhat briefer in comparison to the British Crime Survey.
Yeah.
And I would say start there. And don't become swamped, because you can become swamped down as to, you'll think, well, there's contradictions as to what I've reading in this. And I think it's always important to get your timeline of as in dates. So, you know, if you're going to look at the historical, then compare it with what's recent. See the growth. Hopefully, even better if you can see where there has been a decline, because I think a decline obviously always shows that something is working somewhere. But bearing in mind that trends occur. What's a fraud today might not be a priority as a fraud next week. Is that to say that it's declined, fraudsters have evolved and moved on, or is it to say that countering fraud measures have been introduced which have actually helped to eliminate that fraud?
Or has it evolved into something different?
Well, they're always evolving, aren't
Yeah.
they?
Because according to the Crime Survey for England and Wales, the fraud stats have dropped, haven't they? The incidents over the last couple of years.
On some
But
aspects.
is that
again,
all a
it's
measurement?
what they're reporting, isn't it? I mean, payment fraud is, you know, with using your plastic card, they show a dip there, I believe, as well. But then, you know, that shows banks are doing a lot more on the forefront of countering that too, and dealing with, you know, stopping transactions, or monitoring accounts to see where suspicious activity is occurring. So there's a host of things going on out there. But I think it's important to bear in mind that, you know, when you look at action fraud and the different types of fraud, once you get a grasp of those 100 plus, then they all go into the same pot, don't they? It's a bit like treating fraud as an economy, I think.
Yes, yeah.
You need to have an understanding of what the problem is,
Yeah.
to understand then where you're going to direct your resources as what you're dealing with, and how then is it reducing,
Yeah.
and what other areas are becoming explosive.
I like that as a structure for an essay, though, and I think not just with an essay on this particular topic, but with an essay on all topics, is that you've got to outline the nature of the problem first, haven't you? So if you're dealing with this as an essay topic, outline the nature of the problem in the best way that you can, given that, as you've already said, there are masses of different sources and all sorts of confusion.
Totally.
And then, at the remainder of the essay, talk about how to perhaps deal with some
And
of
I
that.
think from my part, you know, dealing with marking essays, it's originality you're looking for. Because the arguments are out there. There's no set right answer, but actually drawing in those different themes, the evidence that that individual finds, to compile their evidence, that's the joy of the job, isn't
Yeah,
it?
yeah.
Instead of the set structure.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much, Dean. There's
You're
some really
welcome.
interesting statistics there and some really interesting thoughts on the kind of huge, complex world of fraud. Now, for those who weren't able to make it for our induction event in September, and indeed for those that were there and perhaps need a refresher, we're going on now to look at Dr. Risto Tallis, who is the course leader of the BSc Hons in Risk and Security Management. And he's going to be telling us very briefly what is important in the world of security.
For those of you at home, my name is Dr. Risto Tallis, and I'm going to talk to you about security. Before I answer the question, what is important about security, I want to answer my own question, why is security important? Would anyone like to give me a definition of security? Any of my risk and security students? Security is the absence of and/or the perception of the absence of threat, whilst contributing to reducing vulnerability and contributing to organizational resilience. The absence of and/or the perception of the absence of threat. We might be secure, but not feel secure. We might feel secure, but not be secure. So the perception element is extremely important. When you go through security at an airport, you see someone sitting in front of a screen, the terminal by the X-ray machine. If that person would suddenly get up and go away, and your bags are going through the machine, would you feel less or as secure as you were a few seconds before? The answer is, you are as secure. The person sitting in front of the screen is there largely just to reassure the public. The algorithms, the software, and the sensors within the X-ray machine, they pick up the guns, the knives, the explosives. Ladies, when your handbag is taken to one side and they're swabbed and put through the explosives detection system, that's largely to reassure you and the traveling public that you are secure. So one of my friends works for L3 that makes these X-ray machines. What the software does is every now and then puts a fake gun into the luggage. And the operator has to click on the fake gun to show that they're still awake. If they miss one or two of these, then they have to go and take a rest period. So it's largely, you are secure. There are 5 transport modes: road, rail, air, sea, and pipeline. And now, arguably, we can add fiber optic as a transport mode. All of these different elements need securing. Seaports need securing. I saw a report on BBC South Today last night with Kathy Taylor, I think it was, in Portsmouth Port. And she was talking about the impacts of Brexit and how we're all going to have food shortages. Well, how do we manage before Maastricht Treaty? The experts say that every civilized nation is 4 meals away from anarchy. So any terrorist who wants to disrupt our food situation, food supplies, needs to knock out the container terminal in Southampton, Felixstowe, Immingham, and Liverpool. If they cannot, much of our food is imported into this country. If we can't get those imports in, then we're going to be in serious trouble. Today is the 5th anniversary of the Al-Shabaab attack on the Westgate shopping centre in Nairobi. Al-Shabaab took over, and for 3 days they set fire to and killed 62 civilians and 5 soldiers before the 4 attackers were finally killed, with 200 wounded in the process. So this is why security is important. We need to have armed guards. 2 of my new students are former Royal Marines, also privately contracted armed security personnel protecting vessel convoys, protecting vessels through the Gulf of Aden and Indian Ocean. Some of these container vessels that they were protecting contained the smartphones which you're currently using. You have no idea the amount of security which is protecting your smartphones, bicycles, washing machines, whatever, as it traverses from one side of the world to the next. CCTV in this country is a legacy of the IRA. CCTV is brilliant. I was probably picked up at about 12 camera systems on my way here from my office. But that means that we can also catch and embarrass a couple of Russian cathedral enthusiasts. And I've no idea why they went to see a 123-meter spire, given that it's 42 meters taller than the bell tower in the Kremlin. What's important about security? Security must be proportionate, and it must be delivered in a cost-effective way. Finally, how is security related to risk and resilience? If you consider risk in its 3 constituent parts of threat, vulnerability, and consequence, and if you consider resilience in 2 dimensions, in terms of active resilience to interruption measures and passive resilience for recovery measures, risk and resilience are related in that resilience to interruption measures have a direct bearing on reducing an organization's vulnerability, and the passive resilience for recovery measures have an impact on reducing organizational consequences once an event has taken place. Now, security also has a direct bearing on reducing threat, reducing vulnerability, and assisting with resilience. And that is all I have to say.
Welcome back to the sofa. I'm joined now by Dr. Nathan Hall, who is our Associate Head Academic. We're not talking about anything to do with that today.
We're absolutely not talking about anything to do with quality standards or curriculum today. No. Dissertations today.
Dissertations, yeah, fabulous. So all of our students, when they get to their final stage of their degrees, write a dissertation, which is often one of the scariest things, according to students, that they have to do. So we're here today to talk about that and to perhaps dispel some of the scary myths about dissertations. And you're going to ask me lots of tough questions.
Well, I'm going to have a go. I think a lot of students find it quite scary because it's sort of clouded in mystery and secrecy, and it's this thing that you do at the very end of your studies, and I think there's a tendency for people just to push it to the back there.
Yeah.
But actually it's really useful, I think, to start thinking early.
Yeah.
And an awful lot of students quite early on, even when they first start, say, I've got an idea of something I want to do.
Yeah.
And then the next question that comes out really is how do I get from this broad idea and turn it into a research question that I can do actually something I can actually do with?
Yeah. Read. I think that could possibly be the answer to all of the questions that you're probably going to ask me this morning. The answer will be read.
Some new questions.
Because you might have this fabulous idea, lovely, but in order to be able to narrow it down into a research question, you need to have a grip of the literature. So this is why I will often say to students that don't dismiss the research proposal that you do when you're at level 5. Because actually, although you don't have to write a lot about a specific topic, you need to know in depth the topic in order to be able to work out what's important within that topic and what needs researching. So the way to go about working out what your research question is going to be, I would say, is to just dive into the literature, read as much as you can, and then you'll start to see, won't you, what the patterns are, what's important, what's not important, what's been studied before, where the gaps in the knowledge are, where the gaps in the literature are, and then you can start to hone down into a research question. And the other thing that I would say is narrow, 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 narrow. Keep narrowing that focus, because I think there's a tendency for students to think, oh, I've got to write 10,000 words. I'm going to have to consider the entire criminal justice system in this country and the rest of the world in order to fill 10,000 words. And that's the mistake I think that some people make, that if there isn't a nice focus to the dissertation, it can just be all over the place. So even though you're probably thinking, I can't write about something that specific and that narrow because I won't have enough to write about, I don't know about you, but I don't think I've ever supervised a student that doesn't have enough to say.
No, and it's always the case that students say, I don't know how I'm going to fill 10,000 words. Yes. And then at the end of the dissertation, the question is, I don't know how I'm going to keep it down to 10,000
yes.
words. And that's always the case. Yeah. That once you start to break it down, we'll come on to structure in a little while, but once you start to break it down into manageable chunks, actually the word count starts to disappear quite quickly as you get into things. And I think you're absolutely right about narrowing it down as much as you can. And identifying through that looking at the literature, the gaps that you can find. Because actually what you don't really want to be doing is regurgitating stuff that's been done 100 times before. Although you can obviously review that literature and add something new, perhaps from your own personal experience. But actually looking for those little gaps that you can expand upon is really, really important, I think. So that idea to research question, read, agreed.
Yeah, and I suppose adding in some variables as well to make it a little bit more interesting. So rather than everything I know about electronic tagging, for example, what you might want to do is just narrow the focus, but also add a variable in. If you're looking at maybe the effectiveness of electronic tagging on convicted offenders, you might want to look at it for first-time offenders, for example, and maybe compare that with offenders who've got a long criminal record. You might want to look at it in terms of a gender balance or in terms of an ethnic balance. So you can add in a variable rather than everything about a particular topic. You can add a specific focus on that as well.
And I think turning the question on its head from what do we know about a subject to actually what don't we know is quite a useful starting point. So you can start to frame your ideas a little bit differently. Okay, good. So the next question that always comes up is, what is a dissertation? And once you go beyond that, what is a dissertation? You kind of find that there are lots of different types. So what are the different types?
Okay, lots of different types. And really importantly, no one type of dissertation is better than another type of dissertation.
That question always comes up.
Choosing one way to write your dissertation will not inevitably give you more marks than any other. So we'll start with the one that people think, oh, I'm not sure I should do that because I won't get enough marks, is a literature review. Perfectly adequate way to conduct a dissertation, absolutely fine. You don't have to go out and do a survey of whoever in order to do well in this. So a literature review would be, as students have done for their other essays, considering the breadth of literature that's out there. So that would be academic literature, the organisational literature, it would be governmental publications, it would be statistical publications. It's not just looking in one narrow area of the library, it's a consideration of all of the relevant literature in the area and piecing together what we know from that. And there's no reason why that can't be original. Because if you've got a very specific research question that you want to be looking at, you're gathering evidence and data from lots of different areas and assembling it together to provide a coherent argument. Probably no one else will have assembled it together in such a way and in such a direction as you're doing. So there's no need to think, oh, a literature review is just writing what everyone else has said. No, there is still the possibility of innovation, I think, within a literature review.
I think you're right, and I think one of the other myths that sort of surrounds a dissertation is that as you say, students think that if I do a literature-based study, it's somehow not going to be as good, and that's obviously not the case. A really solid literature review can be really a productive piece of work to do. And actually, one of the other things that students often say to me is that I didn't know that I didn't have to do
something that was empirically based. So actually you don't have to go. It's not compulsory to go and do research. It's a bit of surprise to students that actually they can do that. But certainly in my experience of supervising students who go or opt for the literature approach, really, many of them find it more useful that way if their work-life balance is a little, imbalanced, I suppose, and they've got other competing demands on their time. That actually, that anxiety and that worry about how am I going to fit in a survey, how am I going to go and do some interviews, how am I going to, analyse all the data, where's all the time going to come from, and what then happens if I'm dependent upon 100 people or 50 people, whatever, responding to my survey, and only 5 do, and all these other anxieties. Now, that shouldn't put you off doing a research dissertation if that's what you want to do and you've got the opportunity, and there's some really great stuff that can come from that. But really, don't dismiss the idea of a literature-based study. If it works for you, then it works for you. I think that's really important.
And you are, master of your own destiny, really, with a literature review, aren't you? You're not relying on anybody else. You're not relying on a decision from the ethics committee. You're not relying on your interviewees or your survey respondents. You're not relying on analysis of the data. You're there. You're in charge.
The only person who can let you down then is you.
Yes.
If you're looking for excuses and people to blame and techniques of neutralisation, if you want to go back to your theories, then that might be useful. But certainly don't dismiss the.
We like a literature review.
There's a lot to be said for that.
Yeah. But then we get on to other types of research. You've got primary research, which will be going out and conducting your own research. The important thing, as you know, Nathan, is that people have to have ethical approval before they do that.
We don't mark anything without ethical approval. That's really important to remember, really early on.
A lot of our students, given that a lot of our students work in different professions, have got access to do primary research. So if you have got access, then I think it's a really good idea to try and exploit that if you can. So surveys would be one way to do this. Interviews would be another, perhaps a focus group. So there are lots of different ways that you can do primary research. So that's one. Secondary research is another, where you can use existing data, go out there and look at some of the raw data and interpret it in different ways for your own ends. And the other one that students sometimes forget about is the case study approach, which I think can be quite interesting. I quite like a case study. So you might be doing your dissertation on crime prevention, for example, and then you might have one chapter that would look at a specific form of crime prevention. So your dissertation would be perhaps quite theoretical about the principles and the strategies and the theories around crime prevention, but you just have one chapter as your case study. And you can do that with other things as well. If you were doing, for example, a look at how the media report particular crimes, you could have one chapter that would look at a specific crime, and perhaps you could analyse the crime reports in that way. So lots of different ways to.
And that goes back to what you said before about not trying to cover everything, because nobody expects you in 10,000 words to cover absolutely everything. It's impossible. But just to come back to the primary research thing, I think we mustn't underestimate the importance of the ethics. And actually, when you're thinking about what you want to do for your dissertation, a really good starting point is is the ethics process that is on the Moodle site. So even if you're thinking, well, I'm going to do a literature-based study, just have a look at the kind of questions that are asked on that form, because that can help you to shape your ideas. And certainly if you've got the opportunity of access through your organisation or whatever, really start early on with those questions, because in completing that ethics form, which you'll have to do if you're doing empirical research that requires ethics, will help you to frame many of the questions actually that will be in your proposal, that you'll inevitably have to think about when you're talking to your supervisor about structuring your dissertation. Which brings me on to the next point about structuring dissertations.
Right.
One of the questions that once you get through, I've got my idea, we've narrowed that down, I've got my question, got that, I've worked out which type of dissertation I want to do. What on earth does it look like?
This is the tricky bit, I think, and this is where it's absolutely essential that students talk to their dissertation supervisor, because their supervisor will have experience of breaking down a research question into what is usually 3 or 4, sometimes 5, logical and coherent chapters. And that's what you were saying about when you start to break it down, it's actually not that onerous a task, because if, as you usually get, a 4-chapter dissertation, you would imagine that each of those chapters will be 2,500 words, which is not far from what students are doing anyway for an average essay. So once you've got your topic and you think, well, what literature do I want to consider in my first chapter? Perhaps in the second chapter you could consider a different part of the literature. So if you were going to be looking at, I'm going to pick something off the top of my head, this could be dangerous. If you were going to be looking at police well-being, for example, we don't know where that one came from. Don't know where I'm going from here. You might have a first chapter that looks at the more complex role of policing in more recent times, how the policing role has changed in your first chapter. Your second chapter may then look at police wellbeing specifically. Your third chapter, if you're perhaps doing a survey, would be your methodology and your findings. And your fourth chapter would be an analysis of those findings in comparison with the literature. So it's, once you've broken it down, and each chapter is only 2,500 words, it then becomes an easier task. But I would say the key thing with structuring a dissertation is logic and chronology. So think, am I telling a story from beginning to end? Imagine that your reader has no knowledge of whatever topic it is you're talking about. Introduce the topic to them first. Talk about what the problem is, the nature of the problem first. Analyse all of the literature behind that. Make it logical, but make it chronological as well. So that if you are dealing with perhaps something around stop and search within the police, you would need to look at the history of that. How are we at this moment in this position? Why are we in this position? Well, it's because of the history that we've had before, and you need to tell that story. So think of it as a novel almost. Tell the story, set out all of the characters, talk about what's happened in the past to get us where we are today, and then get cracking from there.
Okay, so you talked about logical and chronological. I think I might just throw in uniformity into that.
Yeah.
Because, as you say, Sarah, I think, either 3 or 4 substantive chapters is a good idea. Sometimes you see, and this quite often happens with people who don't engage particularly with their supervisor, is that a dissertation arrives and ends up with 7 chapters. Some are 3,000 words, some are sort of 500 or 750 words or something like that, and it kind of just looks a bit disjointed. So I think, for me as a supervisor, I would always advise a degree of uniformity. So try and keep your chapters to broadly the same length. And then, when you're thinking about the length of your substantive chapters, don't forget that you've got an introduction and a conclusion as well. And if you can try and make those broadly the same length, I think. And you should obviously talk about this with your supervisor. And this comes back to the point, doesn't it, that there's no right or wrong really here. Yeah. That actually, if you've got 10% of your word length attributed to your introduction, then it's kind of sensible and uniform to do something not entirely dissimilar for your conclusion, so it balances out. But just think about how your dissertation looks aesthetically. It's you wouldn't necessarily see a book or an article that you'll be reading lots of, obviously, in the process of your dissertation. You wouldn't see a chapter in a book significantly shorter than all the others. So you're kind of trying to mirror the professional scholarly work that you're engaging with as you go through this process, I think.
Yeah, definitely.
And I think that's important. But okay, good. So we've got our dissertation. Okay. We've got our idea. Yeah. We've got our question. Yeah. We've kind of worked out our structure. How are we engaging with our supervisor, and what are we expecting of our supervisor?
Regularly, I would say, and from a very early stage. Now, the beauty for our distance learning students is that they get notice of who their supervisor is fairly early in the process. And because Level 6 takes our students 18 months to 2 years, they've got some time to start thinking about it early, and they've got time to make contact early. So first piece of advice would always be make contact really, really early with your supervisor. Tell your supervisor what your idea is, and then try to arrange, I think, time to either talk by phone or by email to agree that structure, and also to agree the methods that are going to be used, because then you can seek advice from your supervisor about the ethical process of getting ethical approval, and you can, if you want, ask your supervisor to help with deadlines as well. Set some mini deadlines along the way. So I always ask my students to send me draft chapters as they go along. If a student sends you a draft of the whole thing a month before hand-in,
it happens,
and there's problems with it, it's very difficult then to offer any advice really that can be achieved within that short space of time. So send chapters as students are writing them, I think, is really key. And then your supervisor can see a draft of the whole thing at the end, towards the end process. But agree those deadlines with your supervisor. Sometimes, apparently, academic staff have annual leave as well. So it's always worth checking that out. Check when your supervisor is going to be around, when they're not going to be around. Agree those mini deadlines along the way, and just keep in regular contact. Students that keep in regular contact with their supervisors almost invariably produce a better piece of work at the end.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I think those are really good words of advice there. I find actually that in addition to having early communication by email, actually a conversation by Skype is useful because you can put a face to a
Yeah.
name. Because invariably in the past, the first time you often meet a distance learning student you supervise is at graduation. And if nothing else, having that conversation by Skype as you go through your dissertation process means that you're not wandering around aimlessly calling out people's
Yes.
names at dissertation, trying to figure out who it is you've been supervising for the past 18 months. And actually, that timescale that you talk about, I think, is sometimes a blessing, and also can be a curse. I mean, obviously, it's a blessing because you've got lots of time and lots of opportunity to engage and do a good piece of work. But actually, the other side of that is that sometimes the deadline just appears so far away that it's always something I'll do next week or I'll do next month or whatever. So I always personally prefer to have that early conversation, even if then there's a period where you don't have a conversation again about it for a month or two. Actually, setting out those initial ideas, having those conversations, and those deadlines are really, really important because you're managing that long period of time, and I think that's hugely important. And not only, as you rightly say, does it enable you to manage your time and I suppose some of your sanity as well in terms of the pressures that you might be feeling with the other things that are going on in your world. It does enable you to get feedback, constructive feedback at really useful stages. And the last thing we want, and presumably you would want as well, is to have only a week or two when you're asking your supervisor, I'm sorry this is late, but could you just turn it around quite quickly? If as many of us are, we're supervising 10 or more students. If they all do that at the same time, across our programs, it can be quite difficult. So make the most of the time that you've got available. It's a bit of a luxury in some cases.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that's important to remember. Okay, so what's a good dissertation? What makes a good dissertation?
Oh, read. An awareness of the literature. Not just an awareness of what happened in the past, but an awareness of what's happening right now, because we're working in an environment where things are constantly changing. So for an example, if you were doing something about the murder of Stephen Lawrence, you would need to be aware that a new inquiry a new report is being published shortly, a new investigation into the 20 years since the death. So since Macpherson, since the Macpherson report. So you need to be aware.
This month. 20th anniversary this month.
So you'd need to be aware of what's going on right now. You also need to show an awareness of the classic literature as well. So often students, I think, are a bit wary of looking back at sort of, material from the 1960s or the 1970s. That can be extremely relevant. If you're writing something on police culture, for example, you need to know where the literature first emerged from and why it emerged. So it's not out of date. It's important. It's part of the history of the literature. So yes, we don't want stats from 1980 necessarily, but we do want an awareness of the whole literature, the classic studies, the governmental stuff, the organisational stuff, and the academic stuff. That's all really important. So an awareness of the literature. But I suppose my big thing about what makes a good dissertation is clarity of aims. If I reach the end of reading a dissertation, I'm not really quite sure what the aims of it were, it's not a great dissertation. So the aims, you almost have to bore your reader, I think, with the aims of your dissertation. You have them up front, they're in your abstract, they're in your introduction, clearly set out, and you refer to them throughout your dissertation, and then you refer to them very strongly again at the end, so that by the time your reader gets to the end, they know exactly what you were trying to do and how and whether you achieved that aim. And part of that process is about signposting. So it's being really clear. So in the middle of chapter 3, don't expect your reader to remember what was in chapter 1. You know your dissertation intimately, but your reader doesn't. So remind your reader what happened in chapter 1. When you get to the beginning of chapter 4, remind them what came earlier. When you're in chapter 1, give a hint as to what's coming later on. So it's that almost golden thread throughout the dissertation of making it really clear, accessible, easy to understand, with clear aims and clear conclusions, I would probably say, at the end.
Yeah, I think the aims thing is really important, because ultimately that's what you're being judged on, really, isn't it? The extent to which you met your aims by using your objectives, and I think that's important to remember.
Yeah, and sorry to interrupt, but also really important, I think, is making sure they're realistic aims.
Oh yes.
Because you will often see students saying that they want to look at the effectiveness of a particular policy, and then they will look at the literature to find that out. Well, you don't know the effectiveness of a particular policy unless it's been analysed or unless you've analysed it. So I think you've got to be really careful not to be over-ambitious in what you're aiming to do. I am aiming to assess whether all of the police officers in England and Wales are suitably happy and supported in their work environment. You can't do that. So be realistic with your aims, and then you've got more of a possibility of achieving them.
And I think it's really important, and the aims is something you obviously work with your supervisor on quite a lot, but keeping your aim or aims short, concise and to the point is really important.
Yeah.
If you find yourself writing an aim and it's turning into a paragraph, it's too long,
Yes.
and too complicated.
Yeah.
So if it goes really, in my view, if it goes, and your supervisor may change. And one of the things I think important to mention here is that every supervisor will have different ideas about what they want to do. But certainly from my point of view, if I'm supervising a dissertation and the aim is longer than a sentence, really, then actually there are probably questions to be asked about whether you're asking too much of yourself, really.
It's a difficult thing to do, though, isn't it? Because I'm doing a bit of this and I'm doing a bit of that. But you almost have to imagine that if a taxi driver was to say, what's your dissertation on? And they don't want a paragraph. They want quick, what's it on, briefly, succinctly, and it should be able to be expressed like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's absolutely right. But your supervisors will have all sorts of ideas about how to do a good dissertation, and with the time available and the support. Should you use the support, which you should, there's no reason that you shouldn't aspire to produce a really good piece of work.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're starting to approach the end, I think, but we've got time possibly for a question from the audience, so to speak. So we've got a question that's coming from Liz from Oxford, who asks, do I have to write a methodology chapter? Thinking ahead.
Hello, Liz. The answer's no. You need to be aware of literature, but unless you are doing primary research, then you wouldn't want to devote a sort of 2,000-word chapter to methodology, I don't think. Again, talk to your supervisor, because supervisors will have different ideas. But I would suggest that if you are doing a literature review, for example, you would probably want a few paragraphs where you outlined how you tackle the literature review, what the scope was, what your parameters were, where you analysed your data from, but not a chapter. Whereas, if you are doing some primary research, if you are going out and doing focus groups or surveys or interviews, then you would need a bit more of a substantial section in your dissertation, not necessarily a whole chapter. With my students, I would often suggest that they combine a chapter of methods and initial findings, and then go on to analyse it in another chapter. So not necessarily would be the answer to that one.
Okay, so just to wrap up very quickly, because we're running out of time, we talked about the importance of an aim in a single sentence, ideally. So can you say, Sarah, in a single sentence, what's an abstract?
An abstract in one sentence?
Yep.
The hardest thing you'll ever write.
There you go. So don't underestimate that.
But just very briefly, it's the tiny little bit that you write, but you don't write it till the very end. It's about 250 words. Look at other abstracts to find out how they're done. Look at the bit in italics at the top of a journal article. It needs to include your aims, your objectives, your methods, your findings, and your conclusions, and why your conclusions are important. And if you can do that, so it's a summary of your entire dissertation in 250 words. So it's a tough job, and it probably shouldn't be underestimated. And I would always say, send your draft abstract to your supervisor, because it's really important that that's right. It's the first thing that your marker will see. And I'm afraid that markers do make judgments quite early on. So you can change their mind, with the rest of the dissertation, but that abstract has got to be spot on. It's a difficult task.
And in my experience, it can take several revisions to do it.
Goodness, yes.
But don't forget, just because it's 250 words doesn't mean it's something that you just do at the end as a last minute thought. It'll take probably as much time as a chapter will probably.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nathan. As always, chatting happily about dissertations. We could do this all day. Thank you very much indeed. And if you've got more questions, do email me afterwards about them. That's absolutely fine. Now, we have another short video for you now, which relates to our What is Important in series of short lectures. This time it's Professor Mark Button, who is our Head of Counter-Fraud Studies, our Centre for Counter-Fraud Studies. And he's going to be discussing what is important in the world of fraud.
First thing that matters in fraud is it is the biggest crime there is. We know that now because the government has finally changed the crime survey for England and Wales. We didn't used to ask a question, have you been a victim of a fraud? We asked, have you been a victim of burglary? Have you been a victim of mugging? Those types of things. We didn't ask fraud. Now we do. Half of all crime is accounted for by fraud. So fraud is the biggest crime we face. It is also a very expensive crime. The research that I've done with various individuals suggests in the region of £190 billion. So a major cost to society. And also think about the size of the problem in terms of what happened this week. We had the 10th anniversary of the collapse of Lehman Brothers and the worst economic recession we've had since the 1930s. What caused that recession? It was subprime mortgages and subprime mortgage fraud. Fraud in the banking sector in America. So fraud is a major problem. It costs a lot to society, so it matters. The second thing is, it's not a victimless crime. It's often stated fraud is a victimless crime. It doesn't have an impact on the individuals. Well, I've interviewed lots of fraud victims, and I can tell you it's not a victimless crime. Lots of individuals with their lives completely ruined. Some individuals who commit suicide as a consequence of their fraud. Only this week, there were some examples of individuals who have been targeted by a fraud where they're told that there is pornography, child pornography on their computers, that the fraud is combined with a real password that they've used in the past, which has been secured via one of the hacking attacks and bought on the dark web. Individuals have committed suicide because they've received that email. So it's not a victimless crime. It has severe consequences for individuals. Then we have the very interesting nature of fraud. My colleague is going to talk to you about many aspects of what is largely the public criminal justice system. Those of you who are here who come from the fraud sector will probably know this already. The criminal justice system accounts for a tiny proportion of dealing with fraud. There are many, many other routes to dealing with it. What's the largest police force dealing with fraud in the country? Well, it's not the City of London Police or a section in the Metropolitan Police. It is the DWP, Department for Work and Pensions. They've got several thousand fraud investigators. And they use lots of very interesting measures to deal with fraud. But they're not the only different organisation engaged in the policing of fraud. You have lots of insurance companies, lots of banks, lots of private investigators. You have lots of regulators. It's always very interesting to me that you get some quite horrific frauds. Solicitors, for instance, who have defrauded their clients of several £100,000, not being dealt with by the criminal justice system, not being sent to prison, but regulated and dealt with by the solicitor's regulatory body. Struck off. Is that fair? When we think about someone who engages in shoplifting or burglary who ends up in jail, you get a solicitor that steals several £100,000 of their client's money and just gets struck off. So fraud raises all these very interesting questions that I'm afraid most of my colleagues' subjects don't. So the pluralisation and the privatisation of this area makes it an incredibly interesting subject to deal with. And then finally, the gap. You will find dozens and dozens and dozens of active researchers in this country researching all of their subjects. Okay, there are dozens and dozens of papers published every year. But with fraud, for some reason, apart from maybe cybercrime, and that's probably starting to change it a bit, there aren't that many academics interested in it. There's a handful of us in the world. And that gives you many more opportunities. There are chances for you to research this subject and perhaps get published in this subject because no one else is actually looking into this subject. So for all of these reasons, I think fraud is the most important subject. And I will end there.
welcome back. We are joined on the sofa now by Gordon Scruton. Good morning, Gordon.
Hi, Sarah.
Gordon is our very own ICJS Learning Development Tutor, which is fantastic because not all departments have a Gordon. So Gordon is responsible.
No other departments have a Gordon.
Gordon looks after all of our students across campus and distance learning.
Campus, distance learning, level, first years up to doctorate.
Fantastic. Yeah. And your role is all about supporting students in producing better work, I suppose.
Yeah, it's the academic skills. It's the stuff that's not specific to the subject. So
Yes.
I'm not a criminologist, and I'm not somebody who's involved in the risk and security management, that sort of thing. But that's kind of why I was put in here, was because really the stuff that you should be writing is stuff that should be understandable to somebody who is, you know, educated but not in that particular field.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, yeah.
Brilliant. So Gordon and I have had a little chat about what makes a better essay.
Well, I had a number of chats over the years about this, yeah.
And we've come up with this, no expense spared, prop here on our sofa of the things that might be a good idea to consider when writing better essays.
We're big fans of Blue Peter.
Yeah, we're going to go through. No, it gets better. It's got Velcro.
Oh, wow.
We're going to go through some of these. Now, the first one is to use more and better evidence. Should we have a chat about that one?
Yes. So the more and better evidence often comes from the problem that the students have, is that they've done quite a bit of reading potentially, but they don't necessarily acknowledge it in their writing. And so sometimes when a student gets this sort of feedback, they I can understand where they're coming from, but they feel it's a bit unfair because I did all this reading. They're like, yes, but are there citations showing where, you know, that you've used this stuff? No. There wasn't. So sometimes that's purely a factor of them not having employed the citations correctly. Sometimes it is a fact that they maybe, one thing maybe didn't consult the reading lists, which is a big no-no, by the way, because these guys put a lot of time and effort into putting the reading lists together. And if you ignore the reading lists, you're kind of annoying the person who's going to be marking your work. But they either avoid the reading lists or they stick religiously to the reading list and don't bother doing any additional reading. And all of those things are, you know, we want a balance. We want you to use the reading list as kind of a skeleton structure, and then we want you to go and find better evidence.
Yeah.
Now, the better evidence, I want to ask you about that. What would you define as being the
Well,
better
I
evidence?
would say a range, because I've recently come out of my little marking hovel where I put myself for 3 days, and what I was writing a lot on the feedback to these essays is that your reference list as a student looks quite impressive, but it's all newspaper reports. Or this was for a module on criminal justice, or there was just a lot of organisational reports with no consideration of the academic literature. So when we think about better evidence, I would say it's using a range of relevant evidence. So newspaper reports are okay, but not to base your entire essay on. You know, looking at police statistics, for example, you wouldn't base your whole essay on that, or organisational reports, because they can be, you know, a little bit biased sometimes. Academic literature, great. Really have a look at some of that in depth. So it's about using that range of literature and not just focusing on one specific thing.
Is there sort of a hierarchy you talk about in terms of academic literature?
I would say that journal articles are your creme de la creme, really, in terms of what you should be looking at, because, you know, they are looked at by other academics in the field, they are judged and assessed. Whereas a newspaper report, you know, might be very informative and written in a nice way, but they've looked at data elsewhere, they may have a particular line that they want to sell. So, yes, do embrace journal articles, I would say to students.
Yeah, because I think the journal articles, they are the ones that are, I think the textbooks are key for getting your fundamentals, and they discuss kind of the theory and the established stuff. And the journal articles really take that information and run with it and test it and push it, pushing out the envelope, you know, pushing out, however you want to call it. So, you know, if you wanted to get an idea about sort of the classical theory of criminology, what have you, I wouldn't go to a journal article. I'd go to the textbook. But for how that is being applied at the moment, I'd be going to the journal article. So I think that's kind
it's
of
the balance, isn't it?
Yeah.
And there's absolutely nothing wrong with textbooks at all.
No, not
and
at
they're
all.
great. I mean, for
Yeah.
our level 4 students, relying on textbooks is absolutely fine. But textbooks are great to give you, as you say, that broad overall picture of what the topic's about. And then you can think, actually, that bit that's mentioned, and it's probably only briefly in a couple of sentences, is really important. I'll look at that in more depth in journal articles.
Yeah,
and you can,
absolutely.
you can probably find then 20, 30 journal articles just on that tiny little bit that was only mentioned in a sentence.
I'd also say for the level 5s and level 6s, if you're feeling a little bit unsure, like you want a bit of brushing up and a quick sort of, I vaguely remember that a couple of years ago, but I've forgotten what the details are. Just jump into a textbook. Yeah, and go back into the textbook.
Yeah.
You don't necessarily need to use that in your references, but just kind of going back to give yourself a bit of a refresher.
Yeah, just a reminder of the story, really.
We should probably move on, actually.
Yeah, and the next one is that students should provide a clear introduction and essay structure.
Yes. So there's basically two things that an introduction needs to do, as far as I'm concerned. One is to give a broad outline of what the essay is, what the topic of the essay is. You guys have an awful lot of marking to do and a lot of different assignments coming in at the same time. I wouldn't be too surprised if you open up an assignment and you don't necessarily immediately know which question that's referring to. And really, as a reader, you want one or two initial sentences to just locate the reader, you, as to what we're talking about. Are we talking about prisons? Are we talking about criminal justice reform? Are we talking about the sort of piracy in the Indian Ocean, that sort of thing?
Yeah.
So that's the first thing that needs to happen. The second thing that needs to happen is what I kind of jokingly referred to as the train announcement, but it's basically the outline of the structure. Now, here's the key thing. I don't think you can actually write your introduction until you get pretty close to the end of your writing.
Definitely.
You can't.
Yeah.
We've got this idea from schools when we were all writing in pen, and I think they still do it now, where when you're in the exam, what have you, you've got to write, and so you've got to start writing at the beginning.
Yes.
And so you have to write the introduction first. We've got it into our head that that's how we have to write. But my point always is you can't usually introduce something if you don't have a thing to introduce first. So I tend to tell students to kind of leave the introduction to the end. If you want to write an introduction to help you give an idea about what you're going to say, fine, but that's always got kind of brackets around it. It's always going to be a bit of a placeholder. And in terms of essay structure, students have a bit of a problem insofar as they will write, and the way it comes out of them is the way it stays. And that's kind of like taking this jigsaw puzzle, which I happen to bring with me today. Actually, Sarah brought it with her. But it's kind of like the writing the first draft, getting the first idea down is like putting all these pieces onto the table, taking them out of the box. But then you've got these completed pieces of writing, and then you've got to kind of fit them together.
Yeah.
You've got to put them together so that the bigger picture is going to be clear to you, the reader.
Yes.
And that takes more to, the editing and the redrafting is not something actually which I think is given enough time. I kind of cringe when students, I understand, the distance learners, you'll have lives they've got to kind of be managing as well, but I do kind of cringe when the student says, oh, I'm just about done, all I've got to do is the writing, it's got to be in 2 days, but all I've got to do is write it. That makes me cry inside a little bit. But what's your take on that?
So I suppose it's having all of the information, but then it's producing it in a coherent fashion, isn't it? And that's really important. But I think your point about writing the introduction afterwards is absolutely key, and I do that with my writing still now, because I know vaguely what's coming next, but I don't know in what order, and I don't know what's going to be the most important thing that I'm going to be talking about later on. So absolutely, introduce the topic. And I like that, the way that you talk about that when you say, that your marker's got lots to read. They don't know particularly what topic you're talking about. So introduce the general area in a nice, gentle way. Relate it to some current affairs if it's relevant.
Absolutely.
If there's something going on with stop and search, for example, in policing, relate it to an incident that might have happened recently. And then the reader thinks, I see what topic we're talking about. And then bang, tell them how the train announcement, perfect. Tell them how you're going to structure it. And that's really important. because it makes your reader feel at ease. Oh, okay, this is about this, and this is what they're going to tell me. Right, I can sit back and relax and enjoy the ride.
Yeah. It's not a thriller. We don't want twists and turns. We don't want unexpected occurrences and
we want a nice
wasn't expecting
steady
this.
ride.
No, it's a very, very different genre of writing.
Brilliant, thank you, Gordon. I think that's very helpful. Next up, reference fully within the essay.
So the referencing fully thing, one of the biggest issues is that students kind of don't. It takes a bit of time to get used to this, but you've got to get the idea that the references are specific to the sentence that they are in. The citations are specific to the sentence they are in. So one of the problems I see is that like a student will say put the citation at the end of the paragraph, and in their mind it applies to the entire paragraph. It doesn't. It applies to that final sentence, and so you're going to put down things like in the 2 or 3 sentences above that final sentence, you're going to put unsupported, where's your evidence, unsupported, where's your evidence, unsupported, where's your evidence. So there is that.
So the reference needs to come after the point where you first mention that particular piece of research that you're looking at.
Within that sentence, yes. And then then what you've got to do, you've got to make sure that you have got every time there's another sentence that's coming up that's using information from that source, you've still got to acknowledge where that information is coming from.
Absolutely.
The only time when you don't really need to do that would be in the conclusion, because you're not introducing any new information, you're only referring back to stuff that was in the main body. So you wouldn't need to do, I would generally tell students you don't need to put citations, you shouldn't be putting citations into the conclusion, because that would indicate you're still introducing new information, which you shouldn't be doing anyway.
And that point really relates as well to this point, I think, because if students are only putting a reference at the end of the paragraph, you're assuming then that they're only using one source for that entire paragraph, whereas if you are using more and better evidence, you would hope to be basing your point that you're making on 2 or 3 sources.
Well, this is one of the big things, one of the big problems that I see in quite a few pieces of work is that the students kind of tend to structure their work based on where they got the information from, not based on what the information is telling them.
This is so important.
There's a Smith paragraph, there's a Jones paragraph, there's a McLaughlin paragraph, but they might be saying similar things, they might be saying the same thing, they might be saying things that actually contradict each other and need to be discussed together in terms of discussing that point, that topic. So that there's quite a lot of that where that kind of sets off alarm bells when students send work to me and I see the Smith paragraph or section, and then it moves on to the Jones section, and all they're doing is basically just reporting what somebody else has said.
And I can see why students do that, because they've got all of their evidence in front of them. I've got this book, this paper, this document. I'll start with this one, I'll summarise this, then I'll move on and summarise this. If you've made notes and done all your reading beforehand, what students should start to do is identify themes emerging. Yes, this is an important theme. Discrimination, for example, is an important theme. And that piece of work, and that piece of work, and that piece of work all talk about discrimination. So I'll have a paragraph on discrimination, and I'll refer to those 3 things. And that's why planning your essay is crucial.
I think that's exactly kind of, let's go back to the sort of jigsaw piece, where the first draft of a piece of writing that a student might do probably would be structured very much as a Smith, a Jones, a McLaughlin paragraph. But then you've got to figure out where are the connections here, and where can it be maybe moved around to make more sense for the reader. The first draft is for you, the writer. The second draft is for your audience. And I mean, I can't quite remember, this might be something we're about to come on to.
I may have changed.
The idea of audience is something that writers in general often forget.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'll hold my hand up, and I'm guilty of that. But you've got to keep in mind, are you writing to try and get all the ideas down that you know, or are you writing to answer a question that somebody else is going to read?
Yeah, brilliant. That's really important information there about how to structure your essay, I think. And that's why sometimes it's important to go from your sources to notes to your essay.
Yes.
Because if you miss out the notes stage, then you can get into trouble with the
that has problems
list.
with, which I think are about to come up.
Next up. This isn't easy, and this comes with time, so students should panic if they're not doing this straight away.
Absolutely. Yeah, this is something which is great in first year if we can do it, is kind of encouraged in second year, and is required definitely in final year. but the students who are getting the higher marks in first year are the ones who are already kind of doing this.
So how do you do it?
Well, I tend to tell students, I work from the basis of you've done a general first draft, you've made your notes, you've written up relatively full paragraphs, and then you would go through with a very simple two-color code. You would say that every sentence is either going to be descriptive or it is going to be analytical. The descriptive stuff is the stuff that's cited. It's the stuff that's statistics. It's facts and figures, those sorts of things.
But it's what those mean.
It's what those mean.
That's analysis, isn't it? Yeah.
And so it's the so what.
Yes.
Yeah, it's very much the so what. So what I tend to get students to do is that they will go through sentence by sentence and they'll say yellow and green, and for description they highlight if they see that the sentence is descriptive, they highlight it yellow. If they see the sentence is discursive, if it's analytical, it's starting to answer that so what about this question. If it's linking it back to the overall question, then highlight it green. And very quickly you get a pretty good visual feedback saying, oh, well, I've got two paragraphs here that are all yellow. There's nothing analytical here at all. Yeah. And that's great. That just means, right, you've just got to go back to those paragraphs and think about
why it matters.
What's the so what? Where's
and
the
I
link
suppose
back to the question?
What we were talking about earlier with the sort of discrimination idea, if you were writing about that, for example, rather than having your paragraph on so-and-so said this, so-and-so said that, so-and-so said that, which is description, if you analyse it around theme, then it's more about, well, these people think this is important and why they think it's important. Brilliant.
Absolutely.
But, as we say, it's really important that students don't panic about this. This comes with experience, doesn't it?
It does, absolutely.
And
it's not going to be a 50-50 balance.
No.
Because
you've got to be telling the story at the beginning. You've got to set out the scene and what the nature of the problem is to start with.
Because if you don't back it up with the evidence, if you don't have the necessary description, then it becomes assumptions.
Yeah.
So
we don't want those. Yeah. And finally, this is my favourite one.
Right, yes, the signposting with this. What is the problem, Sarah, when an assignment is not signposted?
I'm going back to your analogy now with the train announcement, because when you're on the train, they're telling you what station you're coming up to next and how long you're going to be at the station and when your anticipated final destination is going to be and all the rest of it. If I'm reading an essay and I'm not clear where we're going or why we're going, then it makes me unsettled.
Yes.
I want to know why you've told me, what you've just told me, I want to know why it's important, but I want to know why it relates to the question. So go back to the question again and make it quite explicit.
Yes.
This point clearly demonstrates that the question is blah, 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 blah,
I know a few students have told me that they don't like doing that, first of all, because it seems a bit basic in terms of the writing. It also seems condescending. It's like, well, I'm writing for these experts. They obviously understand where I'm coming from, and I have to kind of point out, well, no, it's clear in your head because it's been in your head for a few weeks while you've been working on this, but it's not.
But you're writing for. I always suggest to students, you're writing for an intelligent-ish teenager. You're not writing for your professor of whatever.
Okay.
So keep it simple, because yes, you can have difficult concepts within it, and you can produce challenging arguments. But unless your reader knows why that's important for the question, so signpost all the way through. As we discussed earlier in the essay, as we shall see later in the essay, keep saying, it's like the train thing, keep saying where it's going.
The last thing I would say was that with the signposting, what's really important is that the beginning of a paragraph, which is, I would say, the beginning of a point, beginning of a paragraph is really has to acknowledge to the reader there's a change of topic.
Yes.
And explain what the connection is to what's just happened and where you're about to go. The end of the paragraph, I don't try to get students to link forward. I try to get to link back. So when they get to the end of a paragraph, the end of a point they're making, link it back to the question. Explain very explicitly how everything that's just been read in this paragraph, how does that link back to the question?
Yeah.
So linking forward at the beginning, I'd say linking backwards at the end of a paragraph, and I think that works quite well.
Brilliant. Thank you ever so much, Gordon. I think there's some really good advice there, and not just for our students, for anyone that's writing in any field. I think there's some really good stuff there, hopefully.
There's more information on my Moodle page.
Yes, brilliant, and we'll put the link for that up later. Thank you very much indeed. Now, Alexandre Hemingway is a careers advisor with our Careers and Employability Service here at the University of Portsmouth. In these two short videos, Alexandra is going to discuss how to write a skill-based CV and interestingly, some tips for applying for international jobs.
This clip is telling you about how to make a skills-based CV. Now, the commonest and probably most familiar way to organise a CV is more or less chronologically, but an alternative is to use the employer's main requirements as the main structure for your CV, especially focusing the first page on this. And this is often called a skill-based CV structure. You might then set out headings that match the employer's wish list. So I'd say 6 or 7 is really the maximum you can realistically cover. And under each, add a few bullet points outlining examples of where your experience dovetails with what's been asked for. And then the second page would briefly outline the factual details about what, where and when for each of your various experiences. I've used this technique to good effect myself, both long ago when I had little direct experience for the jobs I wanted, and recently with more jobs under my belt than I can fit in details for. And in the early days I concentrated on transferable skills and how I'd previously demonstrated them. You do need to be really concise with the context though, otherwise you waste a lot of space on when I worked at ABC company as a random worker. And nowadays I would use a really similar approach, I just have many more examples to choose from. On the second page, as well as making room for sections like interests and references, I didn't go into detail for any individual experience, but created a relevant experience section, or you could call it career history or whatever you prefer, and there simply listed the facts of what, where and when of my previous roles in reverse chronological order. And the reason I didn't need to give any more detail than that is that I'd picked out the very best elements from across my experiences and organised them on page 1 under the headings the employer had provided. I knew what they were interested in and made it easy for the reader to match up what I'd done with what they were looking for, and this is the beauty of a skills-based CV. Remember, you don't need to tell the employer everything about every job, and even if you wanted to, there's never enough space. So you just need to make sure you tell them something convincing about each item they've asked for. So to sum up, whether you're just starting out, working towards a career change, or lucky enough to have too much experience to fit into 2 pages, your best bet is to give priority to the elements that the employer can use. The requirements of the new job should always be your focus, instead of aiming to explain everything you've done in the past. When you press for space, ask yourself, how does this line, or these few words, depending, match with the advertised requirements? And if it will help the selector tick off something that they're looking for, you make space for it. If it's something wonderful that you're really proud of, but it doesn't relate to anything on the employer's list, you may need to let it go and give priority to something else instead. But if you're less pressed for space, then obviously all of that bonus information that complements the listed requirements is entirely welcome. And I hope this will help you with the hard process of editing the CV. You can find examples and more information about skills-based CVs on our website and on Prospect's website. In both cases, look under the Careers Advice section to find the CV information. In this clip, I'm going to be talking about how you can enhance your CV for international opportunities. And there may be students among you who are keen to look at international opportunities because your home country is outside the UK, or just because you want to move to a new location, which can be tricky if you want to go somewhere that you don't already have a network of informants or direct cultural knowledge. Fortunately, there is a great resource to get you started. We've invested in a license for Going Global, and your usual uni login will work for this. And you can find it via Working Globally page under Careers Advice on our website. This is a database of useful information for people job hunting around the globe, like it sounds. And while I'm sure it's not completely perfect and foolproof, I'm good, but I don't know all the conventions for every location in the world, it's a great starting point if you want to head to new frontiers. There are country profiles as well as a selection of city profiles for key locations. And it's an American-made resource, so there's really good coverage in that area. And in each case, there are conventions around CVs and covering letters and other aspects of the initial written application, as well as a selection of job hunting websites for the location, with opportunities of all kinds. And to wrap it up, there's also cultural and visa information to get you started. However, you must always check with the relevant country's embassy in your home country to get the most up-to-date and complete information. So it's a really great way to see what could be out there for you and how best you can tackle your job hunt.
Welcome back. We are now with our last guest, last but by no means least. It's a favourite on the virtual study day so far, and that is Linda Jones from the library. Good morning, Linda.
Good morning, and good morning to everybody else.
And joined by Linda's friend,
Pablo, the penguin.
Pablo the penguin. Linda, before we start, because people will be watching and maybe a little confused by our second guest, who is Pablo the penguin?
Pablo the penguin is a IT superstar, recognised last year by JISC as one of the biggest attractions to getting students involved with the library. And he appears on our blog, in cartoons along the library website, and you can see him popping up all over the campus whenever there's an event.
And he's even got his own student card.
He's got his own student card. He has a mini assistant called Pip, and they go around the library creating chaos.
Fantastic. So if anyone has got any questions for Pablo, please do click on the comment button below, and Pablo will do his best,
Yes.
perhaps with Linda's assistance, to answer those questions.
Yes. He's an expert on fishing and fish, so he's very aware of our stocks in those areas.
Maybe not quite useful for our students
No.
in terms of their essay writing, but you never know. You never know. If there's something on piracy, fishing may come into it.
Yes.
We are talking all things literature searching today, Linda, and I think that's something particularly for our new students that can be a bit of an unknown quantity when they first start, because in a good way, I suppose, we've got an enormous amount of resources available to students. So let's say I am a brand new student, I've been given my essay title. Where do I start?
Well, certainly not deciding on the answer to your question.
Yes.
To start with, I think the really important thing is to look as much as you can for the guidance that's being given to you. Now, as you said, we've got millions of pieces of material in our library catalogue and through our discovery tool, but it is very easy to drown in all that information. So I usually suggest, particularly to first year students, that the best place to start is the reading list for the unit. If you start with the reading list, you can see that your lecturer's taken quite a lot of care in choosing things which offer contrasting viewpoints, that perhaps give you a bit more historical background, and that perhaps also give you the opportunity to then do some independent research, but with a very clear idea that this is going to be academic. The other big failing is it is pointless Googling. There are times when I actually prescribe Googling for particular subject areas or for particular topics, but those are limited and you need to know what you're doing. So rather than starting with Google, I would always finish with Google if I wanted to clear up things around current legislation, current government policy, perhaps industry opinion, but nowhere else. Certainly not looking for random essays written by all sorts of people for all sorts of purposes and nothing to do with your particular topic.
Yeah. That's interesting advice. I've not come across that before, that you should finish with Google. And that was something I was talking about with Nathan earlier about dissertations, is making sure that you've got an awareness of what's going on currently. And I suppose that's where it is useful to check that you're really up to date with current developments.
Yes.
But not as a starting point, however tempting it might be.
With my other law hat on, I know that people have got to the end of dissertations and suddenly discovered that an amendment to an act has been passed, and that does rather wreck the whole thing.
Yeah.
So it is, you may need to sort of keep a weather eye open when it's at that sort of crucial stage, but early on I think it's just doing a check towards the end of your process. But I will admit there is this attraction from Google because it all seems simple.
But we also have something that's very simple as well on the library website, which is Discoverer.
Yes. Not quite as simple as Google.
No.
Basically, on the library website, you have two places to search. You have discovery, and that is ideal if what you are looking for are academic articles. What I would say is I wouldn't use discovery to find books. There is another tab which says catalogue, and that will find you books, both electronic and print, and it will also find you print journals which we don't have electronically. Now that sounds like it's excluding distance learners, all this print stuff. It doesn't mean that. One of the things you should do before you're even approached with the first essay is to actually explore the library website and see that there is support there for distance learners. If you are in this country, you can have books posted to you, so there is no need to say that you're excluded from our print collection. Books take time to post though, and I'm afraid you are expected to post them back to us, which actually costs money. So what you might try doing is thinking about using them strategically, and perhaps thinking about using chapters from books. Now, if that was a Jane Austen novel, it would be like sort of ripping the heart out of something, and you wouldn't be able to understand the story or whatever. But particularly in criminology, there are a wealth of books which are not single author books, but are edited books collecting together the views of a large number of people. And those actually, the chapters are virtually isolated little essays on particular things. And those are ideal. Using your reading list or from Google Books, you can actually find the contents pages for those books. And you can actually ask us to send you a PDF version of a particular chapter. This means if you start early, that by the time that you leave university, you will have built up a library of your own to keep forever of all sorts of interesting articles. So that's another way of doing it. Now, those of you that are perhaps operating from overseas will not be able to receive the printed books by post. So the articles and chapters scanned are the option for you. Having said which, there is an enormous market in second-hand books, and it is very easy to pick up cheap second-hand versions of the older texts. It is the older texts which tend not to necessarily be available electronically. Wherever possible, when I get a book order from a member of staff, I check to see if we can get both a print and an electronic version, because I do understand that different students have different preferences, not necessarily because of where they are, but perhaps simply about how they cope with reading.
Yeah. And you mentioned discoverer. There.
Discovery. I think we could interchange.
Which is really useful for academic journal articles, which I was talking about with Gordon, are really, really nice to see in student essays. And you've got so many options when you're in that search engine, haven't you? Because you can ask for things that are directly available from the library, things that have been reviewed by other authors to make sure they're really top quality research, things that are a particular time period in terms of publication dates. So you can see a real scope of things that are out there, can't you?
And that all works from the sidebar, where you get what Discovery call unlimiters. The only problem with that is that occasionally, if you build up too complicated a search in Discovery and then add something else in, once you do the search, you might discover you've lost some of your limiters. So I recommend, particularly early on, is starting with the idea of going for a key concept each time, and then doing the limiting on that concept.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Now, in Discovery, once you have done a search, and you will have to have logged in to do that search, so it's quite obvious that Discovery knows who you are, it will save the search for you. You can build up 4 or 5 different single concept searches, but you can then combine them and do a search including 2 or 3 terms.
Excellent.
And find the overlap.
Yeah.
It's a really good way of narrowing down your findings. The important thing is that Discovery searches almost everything. So it will bring stuff back that is totally irrelevant to you.
But you can discard a lot of that, can't you?
Yes.
If you want to.
It's being clear, and I think it's about narrowing your options
absolutely.
As much as possible.
Because you don't want 3 million research results.
No.
It's not helpful.
No, but it does help us show off how brilliant our collection is and how big it is.
It certainly does. You mentioned right at the start there about navigating the library website and making sure in your initial, when you're starting your studies with us, that you have the time to do that. And I suppose we should always highlight the Body in the Library exercise, which students can still access via their Getting Started website, which is a fantastic game where students, through playing a game of Cluedo, learn all of the different resources that we have in the library. So if students haven't done that, they really should, shouldn't they?
Yes, it really is a way of just introducing what we think are the key points about using the library properly. Having said that, there are other things that might hinder you using the library properly. So if you do have problems, do be aware that on the front page and on every page of the library website there is a little speech bubble, and if you use that speech bubble, you will be connected to someone who's happy to chat with you online. We have somebody in the library answering that from 9 till 5 every day, and at 5 o'clock we switch it over and hand it to some lovely people in America and Australia who are happy to sit through the night and answer questions.
And it's really, I mean, I've used it myself a couple of times when I've not been able to locate something, and it's fabulous. You're not talking to someone with a made-up name. You know, they are actually the person in the library, and they offer you really good advice. And if they don't know, they pop off and find out for you and come back. And it's a fabulous service because you can get instant answers to your questions.
And with the people that are in America and Australia, we give them really clear briefing notes about common questions and how to answer them. We also alert them to anything that might have gone wrong in the library during the day. So if a particular source actually fails because there's a computing problem at the other end, they will know about it, and they will tell you not to worry and go away and do something else.
Yeah, brilliant.
We also check their answers next morning. And I can say that I'm only aware of one really major blunder, but it was rather amusing in that someone actually had checked in overnight to see how they got to a particular seminar room on the campus. And unfortunately, the lady in America who answered forgot that they weren't in Washington and sent them a map of how to get to seminar 201. But it was in totally the wrong university, in totally the wrong country.
We would hope that the student
I think
didn't
they
take
must
it
have
literally.
realised. But we check those answers first thing in the morning, and we contact students directly if we think they have been in any way misled or left with insufficient information.
That's great. So don't be confused, don't be out there not knowing what to do. Click on that button. We should probably, we've talked about what you should do, we should probably go on to talk about what you shouldn't do now. And we've got our top 4 errors when you're searching for information. So we'll go through these and see what we come up with. First of all, Linda, is not understanding how to access electronic resources.
Yes, I think we're all guilty of this. We want what we want, and we want it now.
Yes.
Unfortunately, library systems are not quite like Google Books or Amazon that will deliver at the moment, the minute that you answer. You do actually have to prove that you've got the rights to use them. And that introduces us to the wonders of something called shibboleth. Some of you may already be sick and tired of seeing this, but it is really important that you understand that that is literally a gateway which keeps invaders out. And basically, we buy this material for you. We don't want other people hogging it and you not being able to get to it. So, shibboleth requires a username and password. You don't have to have a new one. You just remember what you're using in Moodle. But the important thing is, first of all, to tell it that you're from the University of Portsmouth. And the annoying thing is that we end up really down the bottom of a very, very long list when you go through the list.
And sometimes we're University of Portsmouth, and I have seen us as Portsmouth University.
Yes.
So if you don't find us under U, we may be under P.
Yes, P is better, but I personally would like to rechristen the university ABC University.
That's a good idea.
Yes.
Be at the top of the list.
Yes.
But as you say, sometimes you first of all have to say that you're in the UK, don't you? Because
Yes.
the first choice is UK, Australia, USA.
Yes, it's a UK Access Management Federation that you belong to.
Yeah. So let's go through this. The first thing that students are looking for, if it looks like, and I know many of our students get confused about this because they see a pay button and they don't have anything to do with that, they are looking for the word shibboleth, aren't they?
They are looking, first of all, for institutional access.
Okay, because they belong to our institution.
You're accessing because you belong to the University of Portsmouth. You can circumvent this occasionally. I'm afraid at the moment I'm having a lot of problems with this at home, and I think it's got something to do with my internet. But if you install the VPN,
virtual private network,
which means that you are sort of already encased within the university, when you log on, a number of our resources will recognise you. There are still some resources which are particularly heavily protected, such as British standards and some of our legal databases. They might want you to actually prove again that you are who you say you are. But it does cut out quite a lot of this. If VPN fails, then you can get in contact with IS and they will sort it out for you. And they have done that for me 3 times this week because I'm really not very IT literate. So they can sort it out.
So you're looking for the institutional login, you're looking for UK, you're looking for perhaps shibboleth, and you're looking for University of Portsmouth, and then it's your username and password, isn't it? And then you should have access for free, that's the important bit, isn't it, to all of the electronic resources that we've got on offer to our students.
Yes, if we've purchased it, you should be able to download it, read it anywhere you like, or read it online.
And once students have got to grips with this, and it may seem a little complicated, it's less complicated I think than perhaps we're making it out, but once you've got access to all of this, then it should be relatively straightforward to do it the next time and the next time and the next time.
Yes.
And as we've been saying all the way through today with Nathan, with Gordon, it's about the quality of the evidence that you can produce in your essays that makes for a better essay. So it's a really important stage of development for students, isn't it? Getting to grips with the library resources, getting to grips with the library website, learning how to search for better information.
Yeah. And what I would say, if anybody is struggling with anything that actually appears to be about university procedures or policies within the library, then don't sit at home and worry about it. A phone call and an email, and we can set up an individual appointment with you. And just as IS can come and look at your machine, we can actually watch you do a search and tell you what you're doing wrong.
Yeah, fabulous.
And point out, the problem with lots of websites is there's lots of detail up in the top corners that you just miss because you're so anxious to get to what you want.
Yeah.
And if somebody's watching and can tell you exactly where you're going wrong, it can actually change your life in terms of how easily you can do your research.
And students, especially distance learning students, should really take advantage of this, because I think I often get emails from students. I got 2 yesterday. I'm so sorry for bothering you. This is what we're here for. This is what we're here for. We're supporting campus-based students all over campus. We want to do the same for distance learning students, don't we? So, as you're absolutely right. Don't sit at home being confused or give up. Keep going. Right. Number 2.
Using Google.
Yes.
Not my favourite occupation. But the basic thing to remember is that Google actually is going to give you what it thinks you want or what it wants to sell you. So I would suggest that you can protect yourself a bit from the selling up option by using Google Scholar.
Ah, good. I was hoping you wouldn't bar me from using Google Scholar. If our students don't know, what is Google Scholar?
Google Scholar is a sort of academic version of Google, and it will find you scholarly material. It's identifiable, it tells you who the author is, and the author's probably got a profile as well on Google, so you can check them out. Google Scholar will pull in things that we don't buy, and it may find you free PDFs of some things, so it can be useful. I particularly like it because it helps you to track things backwards, so you can see who this person has cited, but you can do that with almost anything you use from the library. But more importantly, you can see that the top results are going to be the most heavily used, and you can see who cited them, and perhaps who cited them most recently. So suddenly, from looking at something which is ancient history in terms of criminology, you can come up to something that was written last month. And that's where perhaps you might actually be introducing your own original research into your essay. So as we talked about having to keep up with the news sometimes about changes, using Google Scholar is a way to just keep up with newly released stuff. And again, some of that really newly released stuff will be available freely because it's put on publishers' website to draw subscriptions.
Yes.
So you might get that free and for gratis even if we don't take the journal.
Brilliant. So don't use Google at the beginning of your searches. You are allowed to very briefly use it at the end, but Google Scholar is a reasonable search tool. Number 3, not going to the original source.
Yes, you get yourself into terrible complications. As cited by and all the rest. It takes up a lot of word count, and it doesn't actually tell the lecturer that you've done anything besides read the textbook. It's also the fact that people don't actually understand necessarily what they're looking at. So it may come as a surprise to some people that press releases issued by the government of speeches they are about to make can actually not be accurate representations of what is said on the day. So it's important to think about the timeline of what it is that you've got in front of you and its particular worth.
And I always think if you're citing something heavily, you should try to find the original source if you can. And if it's easily accessible in the library, there's almost no excuse for it. And the difficulty in reporting what someone else has said about someone else's work and what someone else has is that you're not necessarily getting what they said. If I'm trying to understand what Gordon said to you earlier and you've told me that Gordon said to you earlier, I'm not sure we're getting the full story here. I need to go to Gordon and find out what he said rather than having your interpretation of what he said. So
because we all filter things.
Yeah, absolutely.
No, and I think as well, distinguishing between government policy indicators and actual legislation. One's got legal force, the other may only be an academic discussion still.
And that's, I suppose, a danger as well of using newspaper reports, because newspaper reports, as you know, will often cite data, but they will often cite their interpretation of the data. If they're citing the data, there's no reason why the student can't go and find the data and use that.
And good newspaper sources always refer you to their data. So the Guardian's particularly good at this. But of course, newspapers can be distorted somewhat, and I'm afraid my assistant Sharon is American, and I am constantly bombarded with fake news from America from her as to how outrageous it can be. But I think that the latest thing is actually people printing false versions of the Washington Post to distribute in Washington.
Oh, goodness. I was very interested in this, actually, Linda. I saw a newspaper article about this the other day, that there's a new search engine that Microsoft has got. It's called Microsoft Edge, that issues warnings about certain websites. And one of those is the Daily Mail website, where it says, if you search for the Daily Mail, it says, proceed with caution. This website generally fails to maintain basic standards of accuracy and accountability. So there are warnings now about these particular sites.
And people do need to be aware that this happens. I think possibly in this country we're quite used to the fact that there are political biases and particular bends in our news sources. I don't think there's quite so much outright lying, perhaps. But if you go to another country, you are going to have to think about the political biases, but perhaps the religious biases, or other things which are influencing news reporting in that area.
So students need to be quite discerning, don't they? And that's, I suppose, an advantage of looking for multiple sources. So not relying on one source of evidence to prove or disprove what you're saying, but actually to look at a variety of sources in order to offer a bit more. Excellent. And finally, and importantly, Linda, is this one.
Right, well, we've already talked about that. Before you give up, you contact someone.
Absolutely.
They will help. It might be me, it might be Sarah, it might be Gordon, but if you've got a problem, don't sit there and stew.
Yeah, because there are so many sources of support out there for our distance learning students. So it's really important. And you know, if you can bear in mind some of these errors and take some of the advice that Linda's been talking about today, the advice that Nathan and I were talking about, the advice that Gordon was talking about, using lots of different types of evidence, being discerning with your evidence, knowing how to search. If you can incorporate some of this advice in your essays, hopefully we'll see some more content students and some higher marks coming out.
And I'll have more to do.
And Pablo
Which
will be
I
busy.
enjoy. And Pablo will help.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Linda. As ever, really informative and really useful guidance for our students out there. Now we're back with Alexandra, who in these two very short videos is now going to be considering fiddly formatting in your CV. And really importantly, and we've been talking about sources of help, how to access the help of our Careers and Employability Service.
In this clip, I'm going to be talking about some of the fiddly aspects of formatting, some things that are worth remembering to make things work. When it comes to laying out a CV document and deciding how to structure it, many people really find this a challenge and quite frustrating. And I think one of the reasons behind this is that there are so many different options with CVs. There simply isn't a single right or wrong way to do it, and what works best for you wouldn't necessarily suit the next person at all. So whatever examples you look at or suggestions you find, they're likely to have both pros and cons, especially when you take your own personal circumstances into account. Having said that, there are some simple rules, or correction, maybe I should say they are firm guidelines, because some rules really are made to be broken when it's justified. You may well not fit the mould and you shouldn't have to try. Anyway, there are a few tips that are likely to suit most of us on most occasions for UK applications. Begin with your contact details at the head of the page, and there is no need for curriculum vitae to take up space at the top. If you're posting the CV online rather than sending it directly, do consider security, and some would say you don't need to give your street address. Think about how much information you're giving away. Always aim to finish with 2 full balanced pages of text to give a professional, well-organised impression. This is massively better than 1.5 pages, which can just look like you've run out of steam and got nothing much to say. Always choose a clear, easy-to-read font that's available for all operating systems, so something like Arial, Verdana, Calibri, Times New Roman. The first few of those are all sans serif fonts, which make for spacious, easy reading on the page, and Times New Roman is a more traditional font that can really help to give a formal impression. Whichever you choose, you're probably going to need to use size 10 or 12 to keep it clear and easy to read. And my final rule is to make sure that you use consistent headings and subheadings to separate the different elements of your document. It doesn't particularly matter which style you choose, as long as you organise each heading level the same way every time. So each new section should have the same formatting. My CV, for example, all the headings are in bold capitals, and the subheadings within each section in my CV are just bold but lowercase regular text. And watch out for your font size and spacing too, as these are often areas where I see inconsistencies that look messy and careless and could jeopardise your chances. Another formatting related decision is how you choose to write, paragraphs or bullet points. Again, there's no single right way of doing it. I mostly choose to use bullet points because it tends to make it easier to be concise when you're writing, but it doesn't really matter which you choose as long as you apply it consistently. And always think about how the default formatting on your software or any template affects your available space. Bullet points are usually automatically indented. Do you want that or need it? If you don't, remember you can select the whole list and pull the margin back in line with the ruler at the top of the screen. It's all under your control, so don't let the computer take charge. In this clip, I want to just remind you all that distance learning students are entitled to the same level of support as all our other students, even if you may prefer to access it in a slightly different way. For example, many campus-based students who want to update their CV drop into our centre every day, no appointment needed. And we realise that this is less likely to be an option for distance learners, so it may well suit you better to book a time to speak to an advisor about your plans and how best to present yourself. The best way to do this is to call our front of house staff on 02392 842684 so they can see all the available appointments and find one that's convenient for you. We can run your appointment over the phone or video chat using Google Hangouts, and that's part of your university Gmail package, and we'll call you so you don't have to worry about the price of international calls if you're overseas. We also have information and advice about CVs available all the time through our website, where you'll find plenty of other useful stuff as well. And if you can't find what you're looking for, please do email or call us and we'll try to point you in the right direction. CVs are an interesting one because they're personalised, and ideally this means they're both specific to you as an individual, making the best of all your skills and achievements, and tailored to the employer you're targeting, or of course if it's further study you're thinking of, tailored to the course. And while this can make for a time-consuming process in writing the CV, it also means that you can focus on exactly what's best for the opportunity at hand. Great news, you can make it say exactly what you want. Yes, the flip side of that is that you'll need to adapt it to suit each specific opportunity. However, if you're applying for several jobs in the same or a similar field, you'll certainly be able to recycle the majority of your content. You don't need to rewrite the whole document from scratch each time. And I hope that's a reassuring way to start thinking about the latest upgrade that you can make to your CV.
Welcome back. Disappointingly, there are no more guests left on my sofa this morning. So we are just left to wrap up this first virtual study day of 2019. This was specifically aimed at our counter-fraud criminal justice students and our risk and security management students, but I hope that other students have been able to join in and get some benefit from it as well. Our next virtual study day will be a month today, on Friday the 1st of March, and that is aimed specifically at our policing and investigation students and our crime and criminology students, but again open to anyone who cares to join us for a cup of tea and a watch. So next time on our virtual study day, we've got what's important in policing, we've got what's important in prisons, we've got sessions again about writing better essays. Linda's coming back, hopefully with Pablo, to talk about referencing issues, which I think will be important. I'm having a chat with Dr. John Fox about changes in investigative practice over the years, which should be interesting. And I'm also talking to Mark Jacobs about the sociology of deviance. So anyone that's studying understanding criminology or issues in criminology or even contemporary criminologies should find that useful as well. So do tune into that, which will be, as I say, a month today on Friday the 1st of March. Now, it's not too late to send in, to tweet to Instagram or to Facebook. Send your photos of where you're watching the virtual study day. Send them to us with a photo and a touch of snow. A snowman would be even better. And if you can hashtag that with ICJS VSD19, use the hashtag ICJS VSD19, we will pick a lucky winner, not at random, it'll be based entirely on the quality of your photograph. We will pick a winner later on today and they will win a wonderful University of Portsmouth hoodie. Now, before we go, I've had one question that was emailed to me. I don't have the name, but the question was about the dissertation session that Nathan and I ran earlier. And the question was, when will I find out who my dissertation supervisor is? Now, students at level 5 do a module that is called Research Methods, and part of the assessment for that module is writing their research proposal. I mentioned when I was talking to Nathan earlier the importance of reading a lot in order to produce that proposal, because that's where you outline your ideas and your basic structure for what you hope your dissertation will be about and how you'll research your dissertation. So when we have that information, when you submit that piece of work as part of your research methods module, we'll know a bit more then about the topic that you want to study. And it's at that point that I'm able to allocate a dissertation supervisor. Now, ICJS is growing rapidly as ever, so we have about 80 members of academic staff. So we're quite confident that we will be able to find somebody with suitable expertise in order to supervise your dissertation. if you have ideas about that, then do let me know. So once you've submitted your research proposal as part of Research Methods, drop me an email and say, this is my area of interest. Actually, I'd be quite interested in this particular member of staff supervising this dissertation, because that can make my job easier in terms of allocation. Obviously, we've got a lot of students and we need to keep a balance on how many people are allocated to each member of staff. But you'll know pretty early on in the process, while you're still at level 5, just about to enter into level 6, who your supervisor is going to be. And that's really important, as Nathan and I were discussing earlier, to build up that relationship at an early stage with your supervisor, to agree the parameters, to get an understanding of where you're going with your dissertation. So thank you for that question. It's a very good one, and it comes at that particular point. Thank you very much for joining us. It's been a fabulous morning. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope that you've got a lot from it. And I hope that students can watch this at a later stage. So all it leaves me to do is to thank very much the team behind the camera. That's Sam, Karen and Joe. And we look forward to seeing you again on the Virtual Study Day sofa on the 1st of March. Goodbye.